Thanks so much for joining us here on 90s Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi. So, you're all probably pretty aware at this point that it has rained relentlessly across eastern Colorado, in particular for the last 2 months. And that means as of late June, we are officially drought free in Colorado for the first time in nearly 4 years. Yes, that is a point of excitement. As of the June 22nd Drought Monitor update, Colorado is officially 100% drought free for the first time since August of 2019, obviously largely thanks to our very wet spring and early summer. And one of the climatologists who helps makes those decisions, maps, and everything else, Assistant Colorado State Climatologist Dr. Becky Bolinger, joins us now for more about this here on 90s Plus. Hey, Becky, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
So first of all, Becky, I'm sure you are as happy as I am and everybody else is to see Colorado completely drought-free, right?
Always nice to have those wet time periods in between. It feels like we go through droughts so often. I start to sound like a broken record. So it's very refreshing in multiple ways to have more precipitation and less drought to talk about.
Less drought is, I think, for everyone watching out there, a good thing. I guess looking back on the spring and summer, was there a specific event that really helped eradicate this drought, or was it just the kind of collection of all the rain and melted snow that we've seen so far this spring and early summer?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest contributor is the consistency that we've seen throughout the winter and into the spring and into the summer. So this isn't something that just happened in one event or even just a one small chunk of events, right? This started happening back at the beginning of the cold season when we started consistently building up more snowpack. We weren't having warmer than average months, so we were cooler than average for a good majority of the winter and spring. And add to that a very consistent pattern of precipitation. So for Colorado particularly, especially if you're talking about the eastern plains, it's very common to have precipitation events that are short, heavy blasts of rainfall, and then the sun comes back out and it gets hot and it quickly evaporates away. And we've had a lot more days than normal of consistent rain that's lasting for a long time, which is really maximizing the benefit of that rain, that moisture getting into the ground instead of disappearing away. And in between then, it seems like we've had a lot of extra cloudy days where even if it's not raining, it hasn't been overly hot. It hasn't been really sunny and intense. And that's helped minimize that evaporative loss too. So not only are we getting the precipitation consistently, but we're also not having those really bad days that strip away all that benefit.
Interesting. So I know a lot of people probably nodding their heads out there saying, yeah, it definitely was cool. It definitely was cloudy for all that spring. I maybe putting it into perspective, just how wet, cool, and unsettled was the spring and early summer in terms of just how much water we've gotten, and again, all that cloudiness that we've gotten as well.
Yeah, so we know that since the beginning of May, it was a little bit warmer than average in May for areas all around Colorado. But in June, we saw a consistent pattern in a lot of places where the high temperature was below average and the low temperature was above average. And so what you're seeing in that is you've got more of the cloudiness that's limiting that high temperature from getting too high, and more humidity, which is limiting that low temperature from dropping, which is what it normally does. And so those are both indicators when you're reducing that temperature range from day to night, that there's more moisture in the air, and you have less of those really sunny, dry days. And we experienced that for quite a few days throughout June. And when we're talking about precipitation totals, for Northeast Colorado, May is climatologically our wettest month of the year. And then as you start to go south, becomes June and July. So really, May, June, July, these are the wettest months of the year. Now, for Eastern Colorado, May, you typically get anywhere from 2.5 to 3 inches of moisture, and that's what's normal for May. And what we actually saw were totals that were, 6, 7, 8 inches, so double what it was. And then our big winners of the state in May were Castle Rock and Aurora, where they got to kind of 10 to 12 inch range for the month of May. And that's just 1 month. And then we've continued that into June. And so it's really been much above average for a lot of locations when we're particularly looking east of the divide. If you combine May and June totals, it's going to be common to see areas that are, 200 to 300% of what they normally get this time of year.
Fascinating. And I guess what you've mentioned a lot of there has been Eastern Colorado. Most of you watching out there, I would imagine, are in Eastern Colorado. But what is the picture like west of the Continental Divide, maybe more specifically in the mountains in terms of snowpack and also out on the western slope?
Yeah, so if you're just thinking about it in terms of, what's happened in the past couple of months, it might seem like it's been really dry, but we know that the short term, this is only a part of the picture. And June, actually, we start going into a drier pattern for the mountains and for the west slope. So it's not that uncommon for Eastern Colorado to be wetter than Western Colorado this time of year anyway. We also know that they had an amazing amount of moisture accumulated over the winter, pretty much everywhere west of the Continental Divide. We were looking at snowpack that was well above average. And because of those cooler temperatures that we're not only seeing east of the divide, but west of the divide, they've had that nice slow melt. So we saw melt out when we would normally expect to see melt out, even a little bit later in some of those areas. And what that has meant is that they held on to their snowpack. We saw a really good recharge in our stream flows and our soils. We saw those reservoirs bump up largely to back where they should be. And that was after, some really devastating drought years. And so we've seen excellent recovery despite the short-term dry conditions that are happening in some areas. The long-term situation really helps to minimize any impacts that we've been seeing, with the exception of a couple of short-term ones that have popped up, like the wildfire at Spring Creek.
Well, let's keep this good news up. Looking back climatologically on other years with this much rain and this much snowpack, what does this potentially mean for the fall and winter months? Are there good years to look back on with similar rain and snow melt?
One of the things I love about Colorado is also one of the things that makes it really hard to predict, and that it's so variable, right? And so there's not a lot of analogs we could pull from that say, oh, this year set up exactly like this other year, and so this is likely what's going to happen. In our recent record, we know that we had a really stellar snowpack season and spring going into the 2019 summer, but that was the last time we were drought free. But then we saw a very quick turnaround. The summer was extremely hot and dry, and we started deteriorating into late summer and fall of 2019. Also, a good thing to note there is that we were in a La Nina at that time. And this is the first summer we'll have in 3 years where we know we're not looking at a La Nina, we're looking at an El Nino. And it's not a perfect relationship with Colorado, but we do know with an El Nino that generally tends to favor our state with a little bit more of a wetter pattern than when we're in a La Nina.
Speaking of that, and by the way, El Nino, that is referencing the warming sea surface temperatures across the tropical Pacific Ocean, creates a domino effect of weather across the globe. La Nina is the opposite, cooler than average sea surface temperatures in the central part of the Pacific Ocean, the equatorial, the tropical part of it. Just for those of you who might not know. Becky, how do you think that this transition, and I know that often during transition seasons, we tend to see kind of wonkier weather than usual across the globe. How much do you think that this transition from La Nina to El Nino had to do with all this water that we've gotten? And more broadly, what other clues, or what, is it too early to say what may have caused all this water that we see here in eastern Colorado this spring and summer?
That is a really good question, and one that I'm not sure I have an answer
Mhm.
to yet. Um, it is some of the moisture we have seen is consistent with a pattern of what we would expect to see in an El Nino summer. And we do know that the large scale atmosphere has responded to this El Nino forcing in the sea surface temperatures. So we know that that's there, and that increases that likelihood of the wetter pattern that we've been seeing. But I don't think that that has necessarily driven all of the conditions that we've been seeing in terms of the cooler than average, the extended moisture for such a long period of time. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we find times where we dry out and we're not lining up with that El Nino pattern. So I think there's more to the story than just El Nino. But I do think that it's part of the story, and it's definitely more favorable for us than a La Nina spring and summer, which we have experienced the impacts of in the past couple of years. So,
Absolutely. What is this, all this water that we've gotten? What does this mean for the summer wildfire season in the mountains specifically? And you were talking about how June in particular can be a big wildfire month for the mountains.
yeah, we know that fire professionals are going to tell you that Colorado's fire season is 24/7, 365, that there's no time we can't have a fire in Colorado. But if you look at the climatology of fires, we do know that the largest number of fires and the largest acreage burned historically occur in June. And so June tends to be that more active month because of the fact that the mountains are starting to dry out. Their snowpack has melted off. And so the vegetation, which has gotten all this amount of water to help it grow, is now left. And there's less precipitation available. So it's starting to dry out. And we also know that we have a lot of increased activity in the mountains in terms of human activity that can increase the risk of human caused fires, but we can also have increased lightning activity in June, which can also increase that risk. So when you have a wetter snowpack year, it does, in the long term, it's going to provide more growth for that vegetation, which means the potential for more drying out. But it also means you're holding on to the snowpack longer, you're putting it into the soils and keeping those soils nice and wet for a little bit longer. And so what that does is if a fire does start, it is less likely that it will burn out of control. So we know we're still going to see the fires, but it's less likely that they will be as large and destructive as they are like when we have drought years. When we have drought years, that is when we very much increase the likelihood of those fires becoming very large and out of control. And those are our memorable ones, are the ones that coincide with the bad snowpack years and bad drought years.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like more good news there. I'm trying to find any sort of major negative at this point. I mean, I know that there's the potential that, as you mentioned, if the vegetation does dry on out, that sets things up for perhaps a nasty fall and winter. I know a lot of people in recent memory will think back to the Marshall Fire season, but Becky, I don't know. This is me speaking a bit more subjectively, to be transparent. I want to ask you,
Yeah.
because you're the real expert in this situation. To me, I've always kind of fought back a little bit on that because it is a hypothetical and it is conditional on something else taking place. And what we saw in the second half of 2021, I mean, it was so crazy dry for the back half of 2021. That was an extreme in and of itself. So it's not necessarily just we get the water, we get the vegetation, and then next thing you know, you get a Marshall Fire. The Marshall Fire conditions, or the conditions that led up to it, were truly extreme. So I guess what that goes to say to me is, and again, deferring to your expertise on this, would be that this this is really mostly just good news, right?
It is. I mean, one thing I do want to emphasize with pretty much everybody who lives in Colorado is that we are generally a drier state. So it's common to have wildfires. We live in that semi-arid climate. And if you look back at the history of the drought monitor, the US drought monitor maps, there's only a couple of times in that history that show Colorado drought free. So it's only going to be a matter of time. Here's where I bring in my Debbie Downer to say that it's only a matter of time before drought starts developing in some part of our state. Right now, we do have our eye on the Grand Junction area and some areas of the West Slope that have been a bit drier than average consistently for the past 60 days. And that might not be where the next bad drought happens, but to say that there is another one on the horizon. And when we're talking about our warming climate overall and our highly variable precipitation patterns, we know that our state is at risk for more frequent droughts and more extreme droughts. And that is something that we've experienced over the past 20 years. So enjoy what we have now because it is very beneficial and very good, but always be aware of the evolving situation that drought is going to come back at some point. And those are things that we need to be prepared for. And what that means for fire, I know people are particularly interested in that now. I myself, living there close to the foothills in Western Loveland, Marshall Fire was a very extreme event. The fall of 2020, where we saw Cameron Peak Fire and East Troublesome Fire, was a very extreme event. But that can be the climate that we experience now, where we have extreme conditions with drought, extreme conditions with high temperatures, and then you get all those ingredients needed for a event like that. And sometimes it's going to happen in the middle of nowhere where nobody lives and it's low impact. And unfortunately, we have to be ready for that risk that it can happen in an area with high impact, which was just, all the puzzle pieces were there to make the Marshall Fire happen the way that it did. And I don't think that that's something that would be likely to happen again this fall. But I think that it is important to know that it's not a total one-off event, that there is the risk that those types of events, could be in our future still.
Unfortunately, extremes may be the norm, but in this case, the extreme that we had this spring and early summer seems to be pretty beneficial for most of us here across the state of Colorado. So that's some good news, and we're drought free in Colorado. So thanks for explaining this, Dr. Becky Bolinger from Colorado State University, Assistant State Climatologist. Appreciate a few minutes of your expertise and insights about this drought-free and delightfully drought-free Colorado.
Yes, enjoy it while it lasts.
yeah, because it will inevitably end. But for now, good news. But Dr. Becky Bolinger, thanks again for taking a few minutes of your time.
Yes, thank you for having me.